Hello, thank you so much for coming today and joining us on what actually is our second chat this morning. The Mind Is The Frontline. My name's Rosie Kay and I'm curating and hosting these talks over the next 2 days. I'm a choreographer and performer, and I first worked with the Army, well, more than about 12 years ago. Which led to me creating a show called 5 Soldiers, which looked at the making and training of soldiers, the operations of soldiering, which were particularly based on Afghanistan and Iraq, and then the injury and rehabilitation of soldiers. I was proud to be part of the first Army at the Fringe, where we had 5 soldiers in this room to a sellout audience, and it's really wonderful to return. Very briefly, Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Mackenzie and I talked about doing some kind of arts and military conference, but following the pandemic and the way the world has changed, I felt that I wanted to really kind of explore ideas around the future of society and civilization, the future of conflict and warfare, the future of the body and where the body sits within society as things become more digitised. And most importantly to me, the future of the arts. Where are we going and what's going to happen after 18 months of what has been a pretty terrible time for the arts? And I don't want to see the arts as something that's about entertainment and just Netflix and relaxation. I want it to be something that's challenging and has a say in the new status quo going forward. So I'm really proud to have my first team of amazing contributors with me today, all experts in their field. And I'll briefly introduce them, but they will also introduce themselves. I have John C.D., who is an absolute hero of the hip-hop dance world and the dance world in general, founder and artistic director of Breaking Convention, which is at the very forefront of hip-hop, dance and culture in the UK today, and has been over how many years?
18 years.
18 years, John, amazing. We actually worked together a very long time ago when I was a very young, not far out of college dancer. With me also I have Kate Bowen, who is a playwright and has actually worked with the infantry, looking at the first female soldiers that managed to get through infantry training. But she's much more than that as well. She looks at all sorts of interesting subject matter, which I will get into a bit later. And then finally, I have Nicholas Reyes of Control Risks, who is a global security threat analysis.
Yeah.
Without reading people's biographies. And today we're here with a kind of like rough title of Global Security versus Personal Freedoms. So, is it a false dichotomy? Do we have to fight global security versus personal freedoms? And what does that actually even mean? So I'm interested right now, particularly in this post-pandemic world, like how have technologies affected our sense of reality? When we've missed out on that human-to-human contact, has that shifted the way that we see the world? And has that shifted the way that we feel about ourselves? And what do we know? And what do we know that we don't know? And what do we not know? To take the Rumsfeld sort of expression, which I'm kind of hoping Nick might give an insight into. We all know we carry around these phones and these apps on these phones, but do we really know what we sign away when we click accept? I'm really interested in how this influences us artists. Like, what does resistance look like, feel like, smell like in the 21st century? Are we free as artists to resist, to challenge? Or are we already self-censoring ourselves a little bit? Or are we self-censoring ourselves online and not in reality? Or how does that affect us all? How does it affect young people? Are they aware of what's going on? Some are, some aren't. And what do we all take for granted in a so-called Western democracy that could be at threat, could be stolen, or it could even already be lost? So, without any further ado from me, by the way, I will be opening up the floor for questions towards the end. So even if there's things, like there is no question too simple, too stupid. I'm not an expert in this. I want this to be somewhere where you really can ask a question, even if it's just a notion or a sort of like feeling, then please do kind of prepare your questions for later. So can I start with you, John Z.D.? Could you give us a little brief introduction? How did you get here today? Who are you? What do you do? And also, if you can, a take on the subject matter that we're talking about today.
Absolutely. Well, hello everybody in online world and everybody in the real world here. I am John Z.D. and I have grown up with hip hop. Yeah. When I was 9 years old, I first heard the Sugar Hill Gang. Soon after that, I saw Beat Street, the movie, and these cultural, iconic moments really shaped my life up until today. I used to break. We call it b-boy, but a lot of people refer to it as breakdance. We used to do that a lot at school. Simultaneously, I was also doing contemporary dance, and for many years they were kept separate because when you're into hip hop, it's a very particular style, and when you do contemporary dance, it's a very particular style as well. And I was very embarrassed to fuse the two. But once I got over myself, I did bring them together, and I realised that there was something very exciting called hip-hop theatre. One of the things with a lot of my work is I'm greatly influenced by groups like Public Enemy. Yeah, Public Enemy were very, very outspoken with their politics. They always went against the grain, and they always, for me, gave me an option to what we were learning about in music and art, and the news in particular. Chuck D, who was the main rapper from the group, he referred to hip-hop as being the black CNN, yeah? So basically, he was talking about an alternative context to get information. So that greatly influenced me as an artist. And the first show that I made, called Lyrical Theatre, I dealt with subjects like displacement, so cultural displacement, slavery, education, and the way in which education is consciously biased. I looked at the concept of black-on-black violence, which is a bit of a misnomer, you know what I mean? When you think about what happened in Glasgow when it had a real problem with attacks between each other, and they never referred to it as white on white violence. So I really wanted to look at that and what that actually meant. And it did really well. And it's brought me to this situation where now I believe that art has a responsibility to share stories that are not commonly shared, to share opinions that are not commonly shared, and to allow us as a whole nation, I guess, as a world, to realise that there are other perspectives that need to be heard. So I'm still on that journey.
And do you think there is something around a shift with technology and personal freedoms? Do you think that's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think about George Orwell in 1984 and the way in which this screen, Big Brother, is always watching us. Yeah, I didn't realise it was actually in our pockets. Yeah, when listening to Siri or Alexa or speaking to them, that proves that these phones are constantly listening to us, and they're just waiting for those trigger words. Oh, hello Siri, and then they appear. It makes me think, what other trigger words could they be listening to, you know? Also, when I think about, I saw the movie The Great Hack, and what's the name of that company? Cambridge Analytica. And I thought about when Barack Obama, when he came from pretty much nothing, and he was the first black president, the the United States. That was a joke for many years, yeah? For many years, people would say, yeah, until there's a black president. And it almost makes me think, was this an experiment, yeah? To see how the internet can create a new type of leader, yeah? So then immediately after that experiment went down really well, the next experiment was, let's see if we can get Donald Trump in power. And it worked, yeah? And then you hear about, where is it, Myanmar? Like what happened out there and the way in which Facebook specifically was used to encourage people to think a certain way about that situation there, which ended up in pretty much a massacre. So quite clearly, these phones can be very harmful to society.
Nick, you're nodding away. I feel let's have a bit of perspective from the global security world. Tell us about yourself and a little bit of an introduction to your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi everyone, my name is Nick Rice. I work for a company called Control Risks, which is a risk management organization that was founded by a lot of ex-UK military members, and over the years grew in doing a lot of thinking and supporting both public and private organizations in dealing with geopolitical risks, with technology risks, with integrity risks, and with situations, for instance, like kidnap or extortion. And increasingly, my background originally was very much in political science. I went to university not too far from here in St. Andrews. I'm originally from France, and when I came back to Europe was just around the time where the beginning of the Snowden revelations were starting. And I think the public consciousness around the role of government, and in particular intelligence agencies, have in both being the innovation behind the internet, and we can't forget that the internet originally was a US military project, but also some very positive innovations around this, the freedoms that come from the ability to express ourselves on the internet, some of the security. I think a lot of people nowadays have heard of encryption and the ability to exactly stay away from potential prying ears, or all innovations that have initially come from a security perspective and have then progressively been brought in for better or for worse, and I think that's part of the conversation today. And when I returned back to Europe, I started working in Brussels particularly, and worked a lot on questions around privacy, data localization, and how security agencies use data for the purpose of security, and sometimes for purposes that are slightly less pure than just protecting people. And so I think what you were saying, Jonesy, I completely agree with a lot of what you were saying. I think we've arrived at we've probably passed a crossroads where technology and the ubiquity of data, personal data, but not just personal data, every movement that we make today, if you wear a wearable, can be traced. Every searches that you make on Google is stored somewhere. Every conversation that you have on WhatsApp is stored somewhere. I think the question isn't anymore, can we take that back? The question is, what do we know about this, and who do we trust to actually safeguard our personal freedoms, whilst also ensuring that, yes, the internet has made it a lot easier for certain very nefarious things to happen. We see this, for instance, in the organized criminal worlds, where human trafficking has been massively facilitated by the ability for traffickers in Libya to communicate with people across Europe, across the US, across everywhere in the world. And so it's that balance that I think is incredibly challenging and goes to the heart of what you were putting down as a theme, Rosie. And you know, you said it right in Myanmar, Facebook is the internet in Myanmar. And I think that for me is probably the biggest point here is we have privatized the entirety of what was initially a public good. And for a long time at the UN, there were debates around should the internet or access to the internet be considered a fundamental human right? And that question to me is now impossible to resolve, because access to the internet is now purely in the hands of private societies and corporations. And they're not evil entities, but it changes the dynamic from the provision of a public good to consumerism and having to purchase access to it. And we're just at the beginning of this. If you've seen recently when Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk are going into space, they're launching, both these people and through their companies are launching the new waves of the internet that will connect most parts of the world that aren't connected today. So in the poorest countries in the world, tomorrow you're going to get internet thanks to Amazon and Facebook. And that for me changes fundamentally the narrative of freedom, because it's not, are we being spied on by a government? It's, are we being spied on by fellow citizens in a different country for money? And that's a very, very challenging concept, I think.
That's interesting, because I remember someone saying before, the big difference is the way that, like, in the US, people would be happy to hand over their data to private companies, but would absolutely never give it to the government, absolutely. And in Europe, it's the complete opposite. They trust the governments, they do not trust the private corporations, and I think in the UK we're sort of slightly in the middle. Did that ring true?
Yeah, I think it's and you know, to some extent, the example I like to give is, if tomorrow you go on your cell phone and you search for pizza on the internet, you're not interested in the history of pizza through the ages. You're interested in where can I get the closest pizza, and that's a trade-off. No one, I mean, I've never asked myself until I started working on this. Never asked myself, why is this thing free? Why is today the greatest library of information known to human history is completely free of access? In ancient Greece or ancient Rome, the people that were allowed to be educated were the aristocrats and the nobles. After that, it became the clergy. After that, it became back to aristocracy and nobility. But now we have that access that's completely democratized. But we're paying a price for it. We're paying our data. And that commoditization, I think, in the UK is something that people are aware of. I think there is a healthier conversation in the UK than in the US. We have laws, and I think that has been a big change since the mid 2015-16. And there was an activist in Spain that took decades to sue Facebook to gain access to the information, and Google to gain access to the information they had about him personally. And we need to recognize people who take these fights on, because we have now regained a little bit of that control. But fundamentally, are we ready to give up the benefit of not having a phone book anymore and not having to, you know, stay at home if we want to make a phone call, or book the next holiday from the pub when we're having a pint at 5 p.m. on a Friday? These are really big comforts that we've gotten accustomed to, and I think will be difficult to give up.
Brilliant, amazing. Thank you, Nick. I kind of feel a bit scared as well. So, Kate, I mean, you're coming from quite a different place as a playwright. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and your trajectory and why you're a playwright as well?
Oh, that's a good question. I like sitting on my own and drinking tea, and that is what I do most of the time. I based in Glasgow, and I'm a fairly early career playwright. But the reason we know each other is the last play I had that was put on was by Out of Joint, now Stockroom, in 2018, which is called Close Quarters, which was about women in the British infantry. And I am currently working on and developing a play with an Edinburgh-based sound designer and a director based in Perth in Scotland about an acoustic scientist in the Arctic. And then later in the year, I'll be working on a play as part of an attachment at the National Theatre in London about a stunt woman in her 50s. So that's the kind of work that I do. But I'm also, we talked about this before, I'm also working on a script about people who enter high control groups, or cults, so called, which has a lot of crossover with what we're talking about. So I'm a playwright because I am suspicious. I think, you know, I've always been interested in when people lose faith in the state and the consequences of that. And I think evidently the problem with surveillance is it increases that lack of trust. It widens it out, and obviously different parts of society know to a certain degree how much they're being observed, and people find out at different stages what's going on. And I'm sure there is surveillance that does protect British citizens, but we're also very aware of the surveillance that doesn't. And I think only a couple of months ago, the European Court for Human Rights decided it was the GCHR bulk downloads of citizens' private communications was illegal, and within that bulk download there wasn't enough protection for the sources for journalists. So that's very recent. I mean, that happened years ago, but that's a recent decision. And so we now know that British State has behaved illegally in terms of gathering the information of its own citizens, which presumably we didn't know about. And then there's also things like the PREVENT programme, which has been widely criticised. We all know now about police spies and the relationships that they've had with people that they've been spying on, and how they've infiltrated groups like Extinction Rebellion. And so those things obviously cause a lack of trust in the state. And so I want to know, I'm sure everyone does, that if I am being observed by the state, that it is proportionate, that it's the best use of resources, that it will keep me safe, but also that it's proven to be effective, that it's actually evidence-based surveillance and not political gesture or ideologically driven. And I say that because there are other ways in which the British state is supposed to keep me safe, which are not effective. So as far as I'm aware, the prison system is not working at the moment in the UK. It is not preventing crime. It is re-traumatising people. I have sources like that, but crime is going up while more people are being incarcerated, and the justice system in many areas, as we know, is not working. And obviously it's been widely publicised recently that of the rape accusations in the UK, 1.4% of actually get a criminal conviction. 1.4%.
Those that even go to prosecution, which is a tiny percentage.
So as a citizen of this country, I am not being protected by the state in regard to sexual violence. Domestic violence has a very poor record in Britain. So if the ways in which the British state, and particularly the government of Westminster, are supposed to be keeping me safe and secure, are not working, then I want evidence that other forms in which they're saying they're keeping me safe through surveillance of my data or surveillance of other states is also effective, because other methods, as far as I can tell, are not. So those are my thoughts about surveillance and being watched by my own government or other governments. And I have other thoughts about phones in your pockets and how they work. And I had a horrible moment. You asked us before. You said, "What?" You wrote to us and you said, "What has it affected your practice?" And so I had a good long hard look at myself. I said, my practice is mostly sitting around drinking tea, but writing is about interrogating your thoughts. It's about controlling them. It's about observing your thoughts and feelings. A lot of it, when you're doing your solo work on your own, just creating inner worlds, and you need to go in a state of deep focus to do that, which is really cognitively tiring. Yeah. When I first started writing, it was like, why am I eating just chips? Why am I just feeding myself all the time? And it's because you're generating as much, you need as much fuel for that process. So yeah, I was like, eating chips after no, but so you stay in that deep focused state for as long as you can, because you're holding an architecture in your head, and if you it's so delicate, if you broach it, you can lose a lot of what you've done. But you need a break, and your body obviously wants its dopamine hits. And of course, a lot of people know that dopamine is the reward hormone that promotes most of our activities during the day. It tells us to go out and search, it rewards us for finding things. And so I go and I leave my state, and I know that going online or going to a social media platform is the most disruptive thing I can do.
Yeah.
Because it lets in all the stuff, it breaches my concentration, it disrupts my thoughts, my feelings. And I'll get pulled in, and then I'll stay there longer. But I realised I was like, I cannot help myself unless unless that box is out the window, because you've got you get apps to stop your. There's one called not self-control. Anyway, I clearly don't have it. But unless you do those, how long I can stay away from that. And I thought I was quite a disciplined person, but and that is because of the addictive nature, the deliberate, as we know, those tools are designed to be addictive. So I'm assuming, because I can get my dopamine other ways, I can go and tidy a drawer, do the washing up, and then get dopamine from that. I'm not ashamed. But it cannot be as much dopamine, presumably, because, I can tidy the drawer, but I want to go back to that computer. So, and only, any addiction, it's only when you step back and look at how it's disrupting your thoughts and your feelings, your habits, and your relationships, do you realise how powerful it is and how disruptive it is? Because, there are so many other things I should and could be doing that would also be beneficial for my work, and yet I realised during the day I will still be doing that. And it's such a basic thing, but it's actually a problem for my work, and I do switch it off. And the reason you can't switch it off all day is because you do need to speak to people, you do need to do some work, and as soon as you go online, it's all there. And I'm sure there are tools where you can close that stuff in, but the reason I haven't sorted them out is because I want my dopamine. So I think that's the kind of basic thing about that, which I realised when you asked me that question, which is so I'm going to have to throw my box out the window.
I'm sure we can all relate to that, and this year with the pandemic, I think more so than ever. I mean, I think seeing the last talk, I read something, I don't know if it's true or not, but that our attention span has been getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and I read somewhere that
what did you say?
I heard it's 8 seconds. We're got less attention span than goldfish right now, which is crazy. But I really feel for you, because I started retraining, and I was back in the studio on my own doing ballet bar, warming up every day. First in a very cold church hall, and then in a dance studio. And I could not believe my lack of focus, that I could literally in the middle of a plie exercise check my phone. I was just like, right, this has to stop. Jonesy, you work a lot with young people. What do you see that worries you, and are there things that give you hope? In terms of, so I'm saying that because I saw that you did a project asking people, what would you do? How would you be creative if creativity was banned?
Yes. So a little bit of background as to why I did that. This whole 16 months, I feel as though we've not been able to speak, unless we're on a particular side of the debate, whereas if you're on the other side of the debate, then you get lambasted, you get constantly attacked online. So we're talking about COVID, and a lot of the information that I've been seeing has been, fundamentally, it's been saying that we're all gonna die. They're just giving these numbers on every single news item, reminding us of the death toll, and now reminding us of everybody who's taken the vaccine, There wasn't any discussion or talk about the people recovering, There wasn't any talk about how you can use natural medicines or how you can stimulate your own immune system and just basic stuff like that, That wasn't as part of the agenda. So it was clear to me that in all of the time I've been existing in society, I've never experienced this, So I wanted to put the challenge out to all of those people that we've not been speaking face to face with, just to see if, hang on, what do you think about this environment? And there was some young people that was part of it, but it wasn't necessarily just for young people. But there was one young guy, he's 18, his name has escaped me now, but he made a beautiful film with his friends who made a radio station, and they were saying, really political stuff on a radio station, and somehow they imploded on each other, There was another woman that I worked with, her name is Amy True, very good name for her. And she did a video basically talking about the pandemic, yeah? Talking about how vaccines are harmful, talking about how love is what we need. We don't need fear, yeah? So basically I showed that video in the context of Sadler's Wells because she put it online and for some reason it wasn't able to be distributed. Why is that? Why that particular video? And as you see on Facebook, I had the whole thing at the bottom, you know, COVID, this, that, and the other, fact check this, and, you know, I'm wondering who's checking the fact checkers. But anyway, there's all this fact checking stuff going on. So it was quite clear to me that what she was saying was not what the modus operandi is, you know what I mean? That's not what you're meant to be saying. So, I presented that video in the context of breaking convention, which we did a month ago, because in London I think the rules are slightly different, and we did breaking convention, 50% capacity, so there was space. And I showed this video, and when we had one 5-star review, but the writer at the end of the review made a point of saying, you know, but not everything was worthy of 5 stars. There was one video where she was talking about all of this conspiracy theory stuff, and my goodness, that was just, but it just come out with all this fluff, yeah? After getting a 5-star review, wanted to really make a point that he does not agree with this opinion. And it just started making me think, well, this is clearly not helpful. The reason why I proposed that as an idea was for us to be able to have a voice and to be able to share our opinion. Another thing that was quite close to this as part of breaking convention is there's a Colombian breaker, b-boy, by the name of Spin. What up, Spin? He's probably listening now. And I saw him online trying to highlight what was happening in Colombia, yeah, very recently. And he said to me, Johnsy, I've just been putting this stuff out, and it just disappears. Nobody can find it. You know, I'm hoping that you could probably explain to us what that's about, because I really want to know. So I said to him, why don't you work on a piece of... And he's not interested in theatre. He's a b-boy. He wants a battle, yeah? And I suggested to him, look, why don't you make a piece of work, and then you can perform at a breaking convention, and then you'll get the word out, because you'll be able to get the broadsheets, loads of reviewers that will make reference to it. We can also make a really nice film that you can share. So he did that, and for him, it just changed his whole approach to how to get the word out. And he said that he's not bothering with the internet no more. Do you know what I mean? He wants to find live scenarios where he can present this piece of work. It's with he's dancing, and there's a spoken word artist working with him on stage. And he felt as though that was his only way to get the word out. He's not bothering with the internet.
Amazing. Oh, thanks for that. So yeah, that was my thinking too, Nick. I suppose I had a question around, you know, how much do we know we're giving away, what's harmless, and what could be harmful that we don't understand. But I think also Johnsy's got a really interesting question there about like how I mean we know they're controlling what's on Facebook, what's on YouTube. You know, how does that work? And I know that there's been accounts of the people that monitor this stuff, when, you know, because before it was things like porn or child abuse or harmful imagery, and now it's COVID. So give us a little bit of the sort of the workings behind the screen.
No, and it touches back on what you were describing around the dopamine hit. One of the things that we can't lose sight of, and I think this is at the crux of the really difficult conversation that we as individuals need to have with our governments, civil society, but the private sector. Because all of what we're describing here is not a free-for-all access to everybody. You know, Google is a private corporation, Facebook is a private corporation. Every single one of these tools, it's not Like, I draw back the parallel of when the printing press was invented and it was controlled by the church.
Yeah.
And you couldn't print whatever you wanted. And there were many playwrights and many authors who were censored by another institution that controlled the medium of communication. And I think when you ask the question, where did that video go? Well, that video may have violated the terms and conditions that we all implicitly agree to when we go on Facebook. There is that huge thing that no one reads ever. Before you were updating your laptop, there's always, when you update your laptop, there's massive legalese text that explains to you exactly what you're doing. So we can know. The problem is it's made really complicated and it's made completely antithetic to the gamification of everything else on the internet. So you can get your dopamine hit and distract yourself, and within 10 seconds on an app, I mean, look at what TikTok has now on the attention span. We've gone from initially YouTube to Vine to TikTok, and it's, tweets were 150 characters for a very long time.
Yeah.
Because of that dopamine hit, but it also means that our attention span have decreased, and so going through a 50-page legal text on what you are actually giving away or what you have to do to upload a video on YouTube or Dailymotion or any of the other platforms. These are platforms who, to some extent, have a right. They're like a publishing house. They have a right to decide what they agree to publish or not. And like we saw, and again, this is changing, this is brand new. What we saw post the election of Joe Biden and the ban of Donald Trump on Facebook was an admission by the social media companies that they were not just content platforms, they were now editorial platforms as well. They had an editorial line, and this is why Twitter and Facebook now have sort of content moderation that align to their views, and they publish these views and we can go and look at them. But I think it's that's one of the problems, is we haven't had this conversation because it's in everyone's interest to think that these are free and these are completely sort of benign platforms. Initially, the internet was great to connect everybody around the world, but there has always been either financial or political interest behind that democratization. So to answer your question, we give away a lot. And we can know everything that we give away. Today, you can go into your cell phone, no matter what it is, you can go on your laptop, and thanks in part by regulations that have been enforced on private companies by governments, you can clearly see what is actually being recorded. So when you install an application, it will ask, can I have access to your microphone? How many people verify that request and say, why is this happening? And then, but I think the more important question is, do we have a choice? Because, and this was, again, Europe here is slightly different than other places around the world, where increasingly organizations are forced to give a choice to consumers and to users. But for a very long time, if you didn't want your data to be given away, you couldn't use the internet. And that goes back to that, do we have to move back to a stage where the internet is now something that is not for everybody, and some artists, some people who are in communities that are oppressed by their governments, that are oppressed by potential other interests, may very well decide to do this. I think optimistically, the fact that we're having these conversations, the fact that we have lawmakers who for the longest time, if you ever have 5 hours to kill, go on YouTube, paradoxically, and watch various congressional hearings where the US Congress invites social media company representatives to talk about it. And look at the evolution from the mid-2000s all the way to today. The debate went from lawmakers asking how to turn a computer on to now actually asking probing questions saying, where's the data located? Can the user remove that data? Why are you storing that data? And I think that's the positive side of all of this. We are now opening this conversation, and it's the most important conversation in our lifetime. It will be, are we willing to sell our data for the benefit of comfort and for the benefit of access to the internet?
Wow, thank you. Hey, I mean, as a playwright and as someone that's kind of used sort of embedded research very much like I did, I feel like our role as artists sometimes, I'm very against sort of artists as instrumentalism. We're not here to solve society's ills, but we are here to sort of dig in and look at kind of really difficult stuff and subject matter. And I think it's kind of, it's almost, I mean, it's really, our jobs are really hard. But when we talk about real life situations, they kind of make a bit more sense. So I wondered if, like, you could tell us a little bit about, you know, I found working with the Army was a difficult, secretive organisation to get into. It was challenging, it kind of tested me a lot, but once I'd gained a certain level of trust, I was able to see a sort of secret society, I suppose, that the rest of civil society doesn't normally get an insight into. And as an artist, that gives you something really important to say to the world, because you're not out with a political agenda, or maybe you do. I didn't particularly have a strong political agenda. I wanted to kind of show something that uncovers something that isn't seen so much. There's a reason to that, because if we could talk about your real life experience, then it sort of feels like it's harder when we come back to this world of technology and data surveillance. But I was interested to find out more how you did it and what you discovered.
Working with the Army.
Yeah.
Thanks for asking. Just to clarify, I was never embedded, and I certainly didn't work as deeply and closely over a period of time as you did. And that's partly because I started writing about women joining the infantry before it was legalised. So I think it's 2016 that David Cameron said that he allowed women to join the infantry, but then it was staged, so it's 2018. It's the end of 2018 when women were allowed to apply, and therefore my play went on at the same time.
Yeah.
So I never met any infantry women. I would love to. If there's any, I would love to. But I was always writing about a future event, and when I first started looking at the play, it was a speculative future event, and halfway through the process of researching it became a promised future event. But so I wasn't able to get close to the people who were doing it, so I was having to speculate in a large degree. I had, in terms of the infantry, I personally knew someone in the infantry, but I didn't spend time with the infantry per se, but I was invited to go to a barracks in Belfast, the infantry barracks in Belfast, which was really interesting. And I had an enormous amount of support in terms of principally 4 or 5 people, 2 of whom it was part of their job to give me information about the Army and how it works, 2 of whom were personal sources that I located and built relationships with over the years, who advised me, and they were from different branches of the Army, serving, no longer serving, and so on, different ranks, men and women. So yeah, I mean, the discovery, it was fascinating. I discovered, we do not have the time to go into all the things that I personally learned, but I think the principal things I learned were about leadership, as particularly as it relates to the Army, but those lessons go out throughout any organisation. And of course, as anyone who's related to the armed forces or involved in it or knows about it, it's a huge organisation. Obviously, it has lots of branches that do very, very different things. There are lots of different jobs, and like any collection of humans, the culture in one part of that organisation, in one regiment, and within that, a platoon and even broken down platoon to units will depend partly on the traditions in that organisation, but a lot to do with the composition of that group of people and to do with the leadership. So in terms of how women will be able to thrive and succeed in the infantry now they are able to join, it will, however excellent they are, they will need the culture around them to be at least somewhat positive and supportive in order to thrive or want to stay, of course. And I met people with a range of opinions about women joining the infantry across the board, male and female, which was fascinating. So I suppose it was that whenever you go into someone else's world, there's two things that happen. You gather a huge body of just practical knowledge, like, this is fascinating. How much do you have to carry? Right. And a lot of the physical stuff is really interesting in terms of being an infantry soldier, how difficult it is for male bodies, let alone female bodies, and how, and again, anyone in the infantry here, please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was that there wasn't a huge amount of sports science that had gone into research around being a male infantry soldier, so musculoskeletal injuries were very high for certainly the training process of infantry men, because there wasn't necessarily the work that's done on say, athletes in terms of strengthening your core, and being very specific about which muscles you are building in order that you can carry those weights over time and so on. Yeah. And of course, every human body is different, man, woman. Like, some people have a particular, and strength is different in every human. So, like, that kind of knowledge from sports going into what is such an incredibly demanding physical role, I think is, I was told, and I might be wrong because obviously I'm being filtered with certain information, was beginning to go into the training for infantry men, let alone women. But I was also told that if the women had done a lot of core and strength training before they applied, they were way more likely, it's kind of self-evident, but to be able to pass the course, because they had the muscular development in order to pick those weights up, carry them without injury. Anyway, so those kind of things were really interesting from a body perspective. But time will tell about how, because a lot of the debate came down to, sure, women can, the bar is set at a certain level. If women can join the infantry, then, and if they pass the test, they can join. But can they stay the course because they're more likely, women's bodies are more likely to sustain injury over time. But that makes an assumption about those individual bodies. So only over time will we see how, but the nature of warfare is changing at the same time. Anyway, it was really interesting, and I only know what I was told, of course. Like, I was very grateful to those people who were working with me who were candid. But yeah, whenever you're allowed into, and I'll say one more thing, that is in someone else's world, and this relates to the idea of trusting your state. You can only ask people to tell you what matters to them, quite apart from how they do their job. If you build their trust, it takes a huge amount of time, and you have to convince them that you are there not for some kind of information or trauma mining exercise, but you are there because you want to genuinely understand their experiences, and you have an open mind, and you are not there to reinforce an opinion. You're there to discover, and that you will be honest, and you will be respectful of what you've discovered when you turn it into a piece of work. To do. So does that answer?
That's fascinating. I like the final point, absolutely. Just to say that there is a talk at 2:00 with somebody who works with AR and military training, and exploring exactly that when we're looking at the future of warfare and women on the front line, there's all this kind of presumed assumption of historic sort of knowledge about stuff, but it's never been data tested or data driven. And I always used to have an argument that it's very like dance, the army. If you might have the best brain and the best creativity, but if you have 4 sprained ankles within a short space of time, your career is over. And it's the same with dance, it's the same with the army. And when nobody's caring at the very early stages to look after those bodies enough to make sure that you get through that initial hardship, and you then choose the best and the brightest and the most talented, rather than just survival of the fittest. And his work with 4GD is showing that actually you may not want the women to kick the door down, but your woman infantry officer or soldier may actually be able to identify the target much quicker and identify the non-targets, i.e. children. It's a bit scary stuff, but it kind of bears true that women can have not the same strength, but different strengths. I was asking that because I'm interested in the nature of artistic research, and there's an anthropological term now that talks about sort of real-life field research mixed with online research, which is a sort of liquidity of research, a liquid anthropological approach. And I spent a lot of time after doing sort of embedded research with the military, looking at religions and India, online looking at conspiracy theory, and I was well into it from about Jimmy Savile's death onwards, actually. 2012, I started going down the rabbit hole, and I haven't really come out. And I think we've touched upon it a little bit a few times in things we've talked about, and I wonder if we could just, this would be sort of the final thing to talk about before we go to questions, so I'm priming the audience here. I mean, you've all got different takes on things. I think that there's ideas around resistance to the mainstream, but there's also ideas about vulnerability and sort of attractiveness, like why are people attracted to cults, why are people attracted to sort of alternative belief systems, as well as also, Nick, you've got a perspective on how that's shifting views globally. And I just wondered if we might go around and just, I don't want to delve, there is actually a talk about this tomorrow, just looking at conspiracy theory and propaganda. But Johnsy, you've touched on it a little bit. Is conspiracy theory useful? Does it think of itself as the resistance? Is it the resistance, or is there a third way? Is there another way?
Thank you for that question. Because I think the conspiracy is there for us all to see now. I don't think it's a theory. Do you know what I mean? I think it's there for us to see. When we see the elites all hanging out together, kissing and hugging and stuff, yet everybody else is told that we've got to stay fully apart and wear a mask all the time, So for me, I think the conspiracy is it's obvious, what's his name? The one with the funny hair? Boris Johnson. So, he's always, lying to us, like consistently lying. Him and Sajid Javid, the new health minister, he had COVID and he's meant to isolate, and Boris was around him. And then he changed the rule and said, actually, I don't have to isolate because I'm... I don't know what he said. So for me, the conspiracy, it's not theoretical. It's just there. And I just think, how do we read the information that we're constantly being shown and how it keeps changing and these different modelling things that are given, throwing out these random numbers. And then all of a sudden, when people are questioning it and saying, hello, that doesn't sound right to me, then they're seen as crazy conspiracy theories. Simply because we're asking questions about the logic of all of this stuff that we've been given, For me, when they promoted the disinformation dozen, this big statement about just getting rid of all of the people that were having questions, doctors, scientists, that just wanted to question what the process is. So for me, I don't think it's a theory. It's obvious. And especially when you start looking behind all of this and you look at the fact that over the last 16 months, billionaires have made trillions and the rest of us have lost trillions. Hello? That sounds like a massive power grab that is happening while we're all sitting there fearful, not wanting to talk to each other, not wanting to congregate, not being able to congregate with each other, which I think is going to be the foundation of where real change happens. And because that's not happening, for me, it's not a theory, it's a conspiracy.
Thanks, Johnsy. Okay.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
One of the American cult experts, he's now an academic and he's a mental health professional. He was in the Muni cult. He's called Stephen Hassan, and he's written a couple of quite well-known books about mind control and how cults operate. And he recently wrote a book called The Cult of Trump. And because he's identified among quite a lot of people that all the stages through which people are indoctrinated into a high control system where they are persuaded to think very differently potentially from how they thought before, but certainly to follow the orders of their leader, have been employed by Trump, and he also came from a cult, what's called a cultic family situation. So he had a very authoritarian father who used there's a term called thought stopping cults, which is the repeat of positive mantras that so you're not allowed to let any critical or negative thoughts in. His father used to do, so Trump's father used to get him and his brother to chant, "I am a killer, I am a king, I am a killer, I am a king." And so that's just an anecdote from but essentially the way that Trump is able to operate on the internet particularly, but also at his rallies, has enabled him to bring a lot of people behind him in a very specific way, according to this book, but it's well researched and well done. But I think it's really interesting when you're talking about being bombarded, because the internet is a tool that can be well used to confuse, and one of the very first things that high control groups or coercive control domestic relationships, one of the first things they do is to try and shut down people's critical thinking, the left-hand side of their brain. And it's fascinating when you start looking into it. It's various stages that normally employed to do that. But bombarding people with conflicting information is a really effective way. If people are in a certain state when they're getting that information, then there is a cognitive overload, and the only way to deal with that, if they're already physically and emotionally stressed, which is where you've put them on, is to shut down. Because if you're going to stay in front of the information, which by that point you are because you need it, then you can no longer process it, and the analytical part of your brain is saying this doesn't make sense. So you stop and you just accept that whoever's telling you that information is. So that's one. But the fear, and he also talks about fear and the way in which cultic dynamic relationships, whether it's an organisation or individual work, is to instill fear in people of the outside world, and then fear of the leader. Because if you are fearful of something outside, you have to come to the leader for comfort and reassurance. If the leader is then frightening to you, you are, and this is based on attachment theory. I don't know if you've got time to go into it, but it's fascinating. I don't know if you know about attachment theory, how children develop, but disorganised attachment is when very little people, when you're pre-verbal, you'll go away from your adults to try and explore the world, and then you'll get fearful of something and you'll come back, and your adrenaline and your cortisol trigger come back. Normally, if you've got a good parenting style, then the adult will pick you up and you'll get opioids flooding your brain, you'll be reassured. So you can explore, come back, you can explore, come back. If your parent is either frightened or instills fear in you, then you've got nowhere to go as a child. And that's a trauma bond, because you go away, you come back, or it's called fight without resolution. And a child who's had that kind of development will have problems later in life, as you can imagine. And also they will disassociate often, because your brain is flooding your body with cortisol and adrenaline, but there's nothing you can do about it. You're using up resources, so your left and your right brain often disengage in order to preserve your body, but it means that you're not thinking about what you're feeling, and that dissociation and trauma is well researched. So that is what happens, according to a couple of cult writers, particularly one called Alexander Stein, in a cultic relationship. People disassociate because they're fearful of the outside world, but when they come to their leader, there's fear and there's nowhere to go. So you disassociate, your critical brain is shut down. So in terms of what social media pouring fear into people, not being, you're addicted to it, your world is closed down, that's all the information you're getting, you're fighting the outside world, but you're fighting what you're being told, you're critical, literally that the analytical part of your brain is not working very well, and you're pulled further in. Our theories that sound pretty reliable to me. So that's just something I wanted to touch on in regard to.
I suppose, but I'm also resistant to this idea that when I first started looking at conspiracy theory and trying to find academics to talk and work with, they're all like, oh no, you've got a tin hat, or you're bonkers, or the one guy I did find said, well, people that believe in conspiracy theory are mentally immature. And I was like, no, I'm not sure about that. I think it's kind of, some of it is a form of resistance. Some of it can be misaligned form of resistance. Some of it is uncovering, like you say, truths. It's like a way of uncovering, cover-ups, basically. and sometimes it's all linked together in a bit of a bizarre way. But it shouldn't all just be Tin Hat Brigade. Nick,
I completely agree with you, Rosie. I mean, the first conspiracies were Greek myths that were used to found not just societal rules, but also laws and relationships and histories. The histories that we have of ancient Greece, we can't tell what's real from fiction, because a lot of this was artists taking the reality that they lived in and putting their interpretation of that reality forward. I'm a French national. The French Revolution was started by conspiracy theorists. So whether or not, I think the important question isn't, or I think it's just inaccurate and dangerous to paint anybody who has a label of a conspiracy theorist as this lady's an idiot, they don't understand what they're, because there is always a degree of truth. It's the way people, I think, interpret that truth, and often the asymmetry of information that we have as citizens. To your point about Boris Johnson, there is always this asymmetry in the information that we have as citizens versus what institutions have.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the sort of perception of the military as a very secretive organization. Maybe for people in the military, they don't perceive themselves to be secretive, but we have this dichotomy of individual versus institution, and therefore automatically asymmetry of information that I think facilitates everyone. We take mental shortcuts and go, there must be something hidden, or there must be something wrong. I think what's really positive about one of the tendencies that we see in conspiracy theories is that they are accessible today. And that speaks to, I think, something that's less pernicious than what a lot of us perceive or have been discussing for years now. It means that there is no authoritarian control of the narrative. If there's still these pockets of speech, and we as in Western civilizations, in democratic states, and we can argue for the longest time whether or not we have a massive democratic deficit, that these narratives can come out and be openly discussed to some degree, and ideally they would be discussed much more. But I think the fact that there is this act of resistance, and oftentimes these narratives that can bring some truth to them, is really important. The corollary to that, and I think we can't lose sight of this, and this goes back to the security discussion, we have had conspiracy theorists who went to locations with handguns and killed people.
Yeah.
We have had instances of racial violence. We have had instances of anti-Semitism. The Nazi Party rose on a conspiracy theory of Jewish ownership of German society. So there are real dangers to this. What is the role that we as individuals, that our governments and civil society and private corporation increasingly play, is we need to have a dialogue, and we need to be able to de-escalate these narratives when they verge into extremism and violence. And I think that is perhaps where we're not doing things right today. And before we started, we were talking about George Floyd and what happened last summer over in the US and the UK, all over the world. And you saw that debate come to the forefront, but also the anger that people had at not having a platform to talk about this. And this is the issue. We now have platforms to talk about things, and yet we still fall into these violent tendencies, which means that there's something that's not working. Yeah. And it's a breakdown of the public-private individual partnership that we really ought to work on together.
Yeah.
And just to add to that, I think that there's been a cult of polarization that we've been suffering since 9/11, when Bush turned around and said, you're either with us or against us. And this sense of polarization has just continued. Christian against Muslim, black against white, man against female, gay against straight. I mean, it's just constant. And I think it's almost primed us for this place where we're at now, where we're fearful of everybody.
I just want to say one thing on that, which is I also think, particularly in Britain, we're primed for surveillance, because the newspapers like the Daily Mail and Express and the Sun have been using surveillance, military surveillance tactics, as far as I'm aware, on its citizens, on citizens of the UK, and using the outcome to sell newspapers for decades, and that's been allowed by the state, and there's very little legal resource. So we accept surveillance in the UK in a way that it's become normalised for us for information. I was very interested in what you were saying about the public debate, the public realm, and because Naomi Klein talks about the common space, doesn't she? And she's really, but we've just discussed if the common space is owned by private companies, like the atmosphere in those spaces, like the culture of those spaces is exploitative, and even if you don't know it factually, you know it on the gut level that you go into that space and it's not really about you and that you're being watched. So where do you have those debates if the environments we have to go to Facebook and Twitter to have those debates, and yet we know our information is being extracted. So yeah, we need a neutral common space online.
This is, I think you're exactly correct, and this is where we need to have this conversation today, because the internet started as that neutral space. It was at the very beginning, and because we, and as in the collective we, I think citizens have now, for decades, we did not question the direction it was heading into. For decades, I mean, I remember dial-up, and I remember going then to DSL, and then ultimately to the internet that we have today. For decades, no one batted an eye when all of a sudden you could, from your cell phone, look up something on the internet. People thought it was not only normalized, but there wasn't a question. We see the same challenge in climate change today, is for a very long time, people weren't asking questions. Why is electricity cheaper? Why is oil cheaper? Why are these things happening? And we are now sort of confronted with the consequences of that lack of question. And to your point, this is because we haven't had these discussions in public. It's also in schools that we should be teaching, how does the internet work? What are you actually committing to? And the state needs to step in and to be able to give citizens that free space of exchange. And there are increasingly, so in Europe, there are tons of initiatives that are happening, which the UK is a part of, around creating a European cloud, for instance, which would move cloud infrastructure away from the US into Europe for European citizens. And these are really important initiatives because they'll bring that space for that conversation.
I feel like we could go on there, but I'm really aware of time, and I want to be able to offer a safe space, I hope, for audience members to ask any questions to any one of our panellists or all of us. Do we have any questions? Oh, well done, thank you.
Hello. This kind of touches on something that you had brought up, but I guess my question is around arbitration of information, right? Information is such that anyone has access to it, anyone is able to form opinions around it, and we're here in a space where there are institutions that are government-led that are trying to arbiter information and make judgments against them. And like you said, that's increasingly at odds with the fact that information is being privatized and private companies are certain agendas, etc. So my question is, for all of you, how should we be, or should we be, making judgments about what is true information, what is false information? Should that be controlled in any way? Is there anything morally right about trying to determine what is correct information and wrong information? Does that even exist anymore? I mean, big question, but definitely
So,
impact your topic.
I'm just going to try and repeat your question. So, for the online audience, which is about the arbitration of information, access to information, everyone can kind of gain information and anyone can form opinions on information, and some of it is controlled by government-led organisations, some of it isn't, and is it increasingly at odds with privatisation? So the question from the floor was how shall we make judgments about that information as to what is true and what is false? Should there be some level of control? Is it morally right to control it? I mean, you're almost asking, is there any such thing as true and false anymore? Is it just opinions and subjective? Who'd like to go first?
You both looked at me. I don't know. I just think that it's all. I feel like we've just exaggerated what's always been there. Yeah, there's always been newspapers that will always show you a certain opinion. I remember, maybe 30 years ago, that there was the Sun and the Times, and these were right-wing papers. And then you had the Mirror, and was it the Guardian?
The Guardian.
The Guardian,
Yeah.
and they were left-wing. Now,
Yeah.
there's nothing. Everything seems very right-wing over here. And just an example of when Jeremy Corbyn was trying to, challenge, for the leadership, and all of the media was against it. Every single paper. So it makes me think that we haven't got an opinion because we're not shared an opinion. We're only given one opinion. So then when you start having to feel in your belly whether something's right or not, and now that's where I go to. I go to what's happening in there because I do not trust the information that's being thrown at me. So yeah, I can't answer your question really. I can only rely on what feels right, and I guess as an artist, that's what we do anyway, right?
Totally. And
Yeah.
may I say something? I think as in your personal life, you choose your sources, don't you? So you will find critical thinkers that you begin to trust, and you can go to them. I guess there are the news sources. There's Open Democracy.net and Double Down News in the UK, and there are which of course have their own agenda. But I think the problem today is you need to constantly be comparing your sources.
Yes.
Al Jazeera. I go there and you're looking at a range of news sources. So it's exhausting, but you need to keep an eye on all the different forums and try and understand who's behind them, what their agenda, and everyone has an agenda, but where do your ethics lie and where do your views lie, but you can't stay just there either, because for me it's about, absolutely there is truth, and journalism needs to be very carefully protected, and it's being, the opposite of that's happening of course across the world, but the structures need to change, of course. And again, Naomi Klein's good on this, and also Shoshana Zuboff, which I'm sure you know. So she's an American academic and researcher, and she's written a book about the rise of surveillance capitalism. And her takeaway really is that we have to change the laws because you don't have to have a framework where the information is being fed through private companies. And you do not have to have a framework where, to get your news, you're bombarded with information to make it emotionally so difficult to get to the truth. It is new, and we must demand of our states that they put laws in place so that we can access good critical thinking from people who are allowed to do the work of research. And that's very optimistic, and that's a nirvana we've never lived in, but you have to ask for it, because at the moment our news is being filtered. It's always been filtered through editors, it's always been filtered through, but it's now being filtered in ways that we're even less aware of, aren't we? And it's being controlled by algorithms. So there is work that can be done, pressure from citizens groups, and supporting those critical thinkers who I think are doing really good work and have influence in terms of ensuring that there are laws in place, if you can, to try and make sure that what is filtered to us is as best as possible information as it's true. Yeah, there's things we can do. Are there things we can do?
I think there's a lot that we can do, and I completely agree with what you both said. I think to your question, the problem is we conflate information with opinion. Is there today true information on an event happening out there? Yes, that information is actually, I'd argue, increasingly accessible. So knowing how many casualties have occurred in Myanmar today it's a dreadful subject, but it's much easier than figuring out how many people died in the First World War's trenches. Because we have access to the data. We have access to the information. I think where we conflate news with information is a lot of news has become opinions rather than actually focusing on news. And many journalists that I've personally interacted with, and my partner is a journalist, and she will sort of, she was initially in her country sort of getting the original stories, and then the editors would take that story and change the piece. So I think we need to deconflict information and opinion. Can you get truth in opinions? I don't know, and I think that's the point where critical thinking really needs to come into play. I think as individuals, we should be incredibly conscious of making that breakdown. And this is not incredibly gloomy. There are really good things happening. There are a number of tech companies that have partnered with, and not big tech companies, but also big tech companies. Google has a project with a number of the ICJ journalists from the Independent Consortium of Journalists who made a lot of revelations around the Panama leaks and the Paradise leaks and the Panama Papers, around how to start looking at scientifically assessing bias of news publications. And you can access that research, and you yourself can start building, I think, those reference points of saying, and this has existed for a very long time, looking at both sides of the story. But it's a story. It's not information, it's a story. When you go on The Economist, when you go on The Sun, when you go on The Guardian, these are stories. It's not like if you go on Reuters or if you get the information. Now, and I'll finish on that point because I think this is where my argument starts to collapse and gets more complicated. Twitter becomes a problem there because it's easy to tell when it's a story because it's 1,000 words and you can really understand. When it's a tweet saying this has happened, somebody's been killed because of this, to be able to decipher whether that is information or opinion becomes very challenging. And I think here it comes to the point where we need the government, we need the conversation to be all together and to avoid the shortcuts that or the pace at which our attention spans have reduced, becoming or making it impossible for us to determine what is information versus opinion.
It makes me think also sometimes you see these. I had to switch Twitter off during the pandemic. I had to switch it off because sometimes I would get up in the morning, have a look, and you'd see something that was an act of violence. That it seemed to be deliberately targeting us. And then, of course, you'd have that act of violence and the kind of hoo-ha after it, often happening in America, around riots. And then you'd have a whole load of stuff saying, oh, this has been a false flag, this has been staged. And so, again, it's going into that cognitive dissonance, the gaslighting, the unsureness of everything. Well, we've got 6 more talks exploring all of these subjects. The next one is at 2 o'clock this afternoon, where we're looking at the future body, working with a soldier who was disabled through an ID attack in Afghanistan, an ex-Marine who works in AR, and a choreographer who works with drone and surveillance technologies. And then this evening at 6, I think there are some of these things that are going to come back again, because I'm talking with Ken Sukia, senior editor of The Economist, James Ario, director of the Dichotomy Foundation, and Professor Hassan Elahi, a professor of art in America who was accidentally put on the American terrorist list in 2002 and has put his entire life online so as to counteract the intrusion into his privacy. Tomorrow we've also got 4 more talks, so please, if you can't join us in person, you can join us online. This is the first time we're ever doing anything like this at Army The Fringe. It's the first time I'm doing anything like this, so please do spread the word. If you've enjoyed it, please let people know. And just to say a huge thank you to John ZD, to Kate Bowen, and to Nick Grace, and thanks to Army The Fringe and our technicians, and thank you very much for coming. Thank you.